This meeting is being recorded.
Hello, everybody.
Hello.
Hey, Ludmila.
Hello and welcome everyone. We're just gonna give it a couple more minutes so that everyone can join. Thank you. Okay, hi everyone, and welcome to today's presentation on raion-level access severity in Ukraine. So just some quick housekeeping. The webinar will last 60 minutes. Please keep your microphones on mute during the presentations, but we will have a time for question and answers in the end. There is a Ukrainian channel available for live translation with our interpreter Serhi. So please join that channel if you need the Ukrainian interpretation. And also feel free to add your questions in the chat box in English or in Ukrainian, and we'll answer them at the end of the presentation. So today we'll be talking about our ACAPS's new raion-level access severity scoring in Ukraine. We will be presenting the methodology and how we have adapted the existing methodology for the raion level. And also we will give you a short overview of our access trends for Q4, although the full overview for Q4 will be available tomorrow in our upcoming report. So quickly, a quick presentation. So my name is Abim Sharp. I'm a senior analyst with the Ukraine Hub. I am based in Kyiv. ACAPS is an independent analysis provider that aims to support humanitarian organizations, donors, and decision makers to make better informed decisions so they can respond more effectively to disasters. And specifically, the Ukraine Analysis Hub was formed in March 2022, following the full-scale invasion of Ukraine. The Hub produces rapid analysis briefs, thematic reports, data sets. We also provide trainings on analysis methodologies to humanitarian responders and ad hoc analytical support to donors and humanitarian organizations. Today we'll focus on our work in access. So today's report will cover the access analysis framework globally and how we collect data for that framework. We'll also look at the scoring methodology, the adaptations we have made to the framework for the raion level. We will also show some examples of raion level scores and trends to highlight how our data set can be used. And then, as I said, we will have a quick overview of Q4 2024 trends and some time for questions and answers. ACAPS, the Ukraine Hub currently has multiple outputs on access for Ukraine. So I think that what is most visible and most known is our quarterly access reports that come out every 3 months that review the previous quarter's main access trends and the access scores. This is a narrative report with in-depth context analysis. At the national level, we're also looking specifically at oblasts along the front line. We also have monthly access scores and access events data sets that are published. And with this presentation, we are launching our raion level scores. We have also the monthly access events data set, and all of our data sets, the events and the scores are available on the dashboard on our websites via API or also as CSV downloads. So before we go into the framework, some words about how we collect our data. So we have a team of data collectors who monitor the crisis context in Ukraine and log relevant data for various data sets. For access, we primarily rely on publicly available information. So 97% of the entries in our data set are from publicly available information. These may be humanitarian assessments and reports, media articles, and government statements. We also have the ability to incorporate non-public sources of information. These non-public sources will then be taken into account in the computation of the scores, but would not appear anywhere publicly. All of the information that we log is logged as one of 75 different access event types that are part of our access framework. So this is the access analysis framework. We are basically just using the framework that ACAPS at the global level is using, adapted for some specificities in the Ukraine context. We have three main pillars. The first pillar is access of people in need to humanitarian aid. Second pillar is access of humanitarian actors to people in need. And third pillar is physical, environmental, and security constraints. Within these pillars, we have 9 indicators, as you see, under which we have sub-indicators and 75 event types. Now I will be going through these 9 indicators and highlighting how specific elements of the Ukrainian context can feed into them. So our first indicator is the denial of existence of needs. This can come from our multiple sub-indicators. So the public statements denying the needs of people in need, discrepancy between humanitarian needs and public statements, or the denial of entitlement to assistance to certain groups or areas. In Ukraine, the biggest example we saw of this was after the Kakhovka Dam destruction and the subsequent flooding, statements by Russian installed authorities that were downplaying the urgency of the situation and the existence of humanitarian needs. The second indicator is a restriction and obstruction to accessing services and assistance. So these can be physical obstruction to access services. In Ukraine, this is primarily comes from the disruption of services, such as electricity, gas, healthcare, and education, both in Ukrainian controlled and in Russian occupied territories. Specifically, our event called Physical Prevention of the Use of Services and Assistance is the most logged event in our data set. 22% of access events in 2024 were for this event. But we can also log restrictions on people's movement. For example, border crossing restrictions for most men aged 18 to 60, the extensive curfews that we've seen in some places reaching up to 20 hours, and the movement restrictions in Russian occupied territories. We also have a second sub-indicator, bureaucratic and administrative requirements to accessing assistance. So this is primarily tied to requirements for Russian passports to access services and assistance in Russian occupied territories. And then our third sub-indicator about forced displacement of people in need away from services. So with our event called Population Are Cut Off from Reaching Services and Assistance, we can log areas where populations are cut off from receiving assistance. These are primarily areas that with the advancement of the front line or opening of new areas of conflict become cut off from humanitarian assistance. For example, right now, one example would be up in Kharkiv Oblast with the situation around Vovchansk. I won't go into detail about the third indicator because it is not really relevant to a sub-national analysis of access, but it is around the impediments to enter the country. So this would primarily be around visa constraints that we saw were reported in the previous couple of years for certain staff trying to enter Ukraine. Fourth indicator are about restrictions of movement within the country. So here we have our first sub-indicator where we log the presence of Russian occupied territories within a given rayon or oblast via the multiple authorities controlling the territory event. Then we have our second sub-indicator about administrative impediments related to taxes, fines, or quotas. This so far has not really been applicable in Ukraine. We have a third sub-indicator about the presence of checkpoints towards or in the affected areas. As a lot of you may know, there are checkpoints almost all over Ukraine. So to make it as relevant as possible, we try to limit logging this information only to checkpoints that are proven to hamper the movement of humanitarians. And then the closure of crossing to the affected areas. So primarily the loss of access to areas along the front lines, as these front lines have shifted and advanced, especially since August of last year. The fifth indicator is the interference in the implementation of humanitarian activities. So here we have several sub-indicators. The first one about imposition of conditions by authorities on the delivery of aid, the overlapping of political and humanitarian issues within the country, the diversion or confiscation of aid. This in Ukraine, we primarily log in this indicator information about conscription of humanitarian staff and specifically when that conscription has resulted in operational impacts for the organization. And we would log it under the event conditions affecting human resources of humanitarian organizations. And of course, we also would log the extremely constrained humanitarian access to Russian occupied territories under the event general interference with the implementation of humanitarian activities. And this specific event would actually triggers and validates all of the three sub-indicators above. Our sixth indicator is quite straightforward. It concerns violence against personnel, facilities, and assets. Sorry. So we count the number of aid workers killed, number of aid workers assaulted or attacked, arrested, kidnapped, injured, and also instances of looting of humanitarian premises. One of the challenges with the Ukrainian information space and the type of information we have, relying on publicly available information, is making sure that we are logging people who are exclusively providing humanitarian aid under this indicator, and that is something we try to verify during our data collection. Then we move to the third pillar on the physical, environmental, and security constraints. So we have our seventh indicator, which concerns the insecurity and hostilities affecting humanitarian assistance. So our first sub-indicator here concerns basically the level of conflict within the territory, and we do not actively log it because the scoring is taken automatically from the number of ACLED events that are present in the area. For those who do not know, ACLED is a separate organization that collects also publicly available information on violent incidents throughout the world. Our second sub-indicator looks at the targeting and attacks on public services such as hospitals, schools, and other civilian facilities. Again, we do not log this actively for access. We use our other data set on civilian infrastructure damages, and we pull the information directly from there. And our third sub-indicator for insecurity concerns the information about the relocation of humanitarian staff or the suspension of humanitarian activities under the two events you see below. So the insecurity suspending humanitarian activities and the insecurity leading to the relocation of humanitarian staff. And lastly, our eighth indicator concerns the presence of landmines. So we collect information on confirmed and suspected contaminated area. Just to be clear, we're not logging the size of the contaminated area, but whether there is a presence of a suspected or contaminated area within the oblast or the raion. And also, we're collecting information on the number of civilian casualties of landmines, ERWs, and UXOs, meaning the number of fatalities and injuries. And our last indicator is about the physical constraints in the environment. So in this one, we have the first sub-indicator about concerning weather events in Ukraine. In Ukraine, these are primarily caused by extreme weather, snow, and ice in the winter, and strong storms in the summer. And they primarily impact electricity and road transport. We have our second sub-indicator on the severe disruption of infrastructures. This is another of our sub-indicators that is scored directly from our damages dataset. We have our third sub-indicator here, which we use to log, for example, the scheduled blackouts due to energy shortage that we've seen in the previous years, water shortages, and telecommunication disruptions. The fourth sub-indicator on logistical constraints, such as remote locations and difficulties to travel. So far, we have not seen much reporting in Ukraine that would lead us to log information for this sub-indicator. So I have now presented our framework, and I will move on to a quick overview on how our model is scored. I will not go into the maths and show you formulas. This you can go on our website and find our code book and our methodology if you're interested. But just as a general overview, we have 75 event types that all feed into the sub-indicators that you have seen below. Some feed into one sub-indicator, some feed into several sub-indicator. And these are the basis for computing the sub-indicator scores. Those sub-indicators then are taken together and give the relevant indicator score, which then feed into the three different pillars that I presented above. The overall access score is the average of the three pillar scores. Maybe of interest to you would be to see what type of data you can get from our website. So you can get the individual events that we have logged. So the top row, we have a data set specifically on events, and if you download our scores data set, whether at the raion or at the oblast level, or you would get the indicator and the pillar scores as well as the overall access score. Of course, not all access constraints are applicable forever, and we wouldn't want our access scores to simply be a sum of all of the access constraints since March or February of 2022. So we have implemented a time validity system for events that are considered to be short-term. They are valid in the model for 45 days. For events that are considered to be longer term, they're valid in the model for 6 months. As an example, you can see this graph. If we request, for example, the July 2022 scores, then short-term events from March would not be taken into account because they're older than 45 days, but short-term events from June would be taken into account. Likewise, long-term events from January would not be taken into account, but long-term events from March do enter into the scoring. And this is done for every month. So every month you download the score or you look at it in our dashboard, you will know that you will have events that are recent and relevant that are taken into account for that score. Also, there is, because of the extremely constrained access to Russian occupied territories, there is not a lot of data and reporting on the constraints, specifically on constraints faced by humanitarians in those territories. Of course, if humanitarians are not even able to access a territory, then that means that there is no opportunity for other access events or access incidents to happen. And in a quantitative model such as ours, this would lead to very low scores for areas with very high constraints. So to try and mitigate this, we have modified the way the multiple authorities controlling territory event works. And for any time this event is tagged for an oblast or a raion, it automatically gives maximum scores to indicators 1, 3, and 4. Just as a reminder, those are the indicators on the denial of existence of needs, the impediments to enter the country, and impediments of movement within the country. So yeah, as I said, this mitigates the lack of reported incidents in the occupied territories. And also by ignoring this event, we can create a sort of virtual score for non-occupied areas of frontline oblast or raions. Why did we decide to move on to the raion level? and apply our model to a lower administrative level? Well, access developments in Ukraine are becoming increasingly granular. In the first 2 years of the conflict, we did have large scale exchange of territorial control between the Russian and the Ukrainian sides. This is no longer the case. And access developments are happening at this settlement or even Hromada level. So we also had to adapt our methodology to that reality. Data since we started the data set, the data was already logged and collected at the raion level. So actually creating this model, raion level model, did not require any changes to our data collection procedures. And we are also just responding to the expectations and feedback of our audience and the humanitarian community to our access work. We have made several adaptations to the methodology. So overall, the framework is the same as at the oblast level framework that I have just presented. We have, however, decided to ignore the third indicator on impediments to enter the country because we assume that it is not very relevant for an analysis at this subnational level. And having this indicator scored at 0 for every raion would just artificially lower the score. We have also scaled down the thresholds for some indicators that are computed based on the number of events. So if we look at sub-indicator 6 on the violence against personnel, facilities, and assets, or the number of conflict events in sub-indicator 7.1, or the sub-indicators that take into account the number of infrastructure damages, we have basically scaled down the thresholds in proportion with the number of entries at the raion level, just to make our scores make sense. There are also of course, some data gaps, and not everything is available at the raion level. So by doing an analysis of what we had in our data set, we found that information on weather-related constraints, telecommunication cuts, and water scarcity are not often communicated at the raion level, at least publicly. These concern sub-indicator 9.3, 9.1, and 9.4. So we have decided to keep these at the oblast level and make the score the same for all raions within an oblast. So as with any methodology, there are certain limitations and there are certain mitigations that can be taken for those limitations. The main one is that our model is a purely quantitative model based on the events that are reported and logged. So our access scores are sensitive to reporting. Areas that do receive stronger media attention, stronger humanitarian attention, but do face humanitarian challenges are likely to have a higher score than areas with extreme constraints that do not get as much media and humanitarian attention. We do try to mitigate this by having a constant verification of our scores to spot potential data collection gaps. Our goal within the team is that we have to be able to explain every single variation, month-to-month variation in the scores down to the sub-indicator level, to be confident that what we have in our data set is as much as possible driven by the context rather than by the reporting. And as I said before, also the automatic maximum scores in certain indicators for Russian occupied territories. At the raion level specifically, certain raions may see lower than expected overall access severity scores. This is particularly the case for raions in Russian occupied areas that are further away from the front line, since conflict intensity, which is a key component of the third pillar, is lower. And as the overall access severity score is an average of the 3 pillars, then that score in the third pillar kind of lowers the overall access score. For these raions, we would recommend looking at the 3 pillars independently, as they may provide a more accurate reflection of the actual situation. And I will show you some visual examples of how, when looking at the access scores with the 3 pillars, we can see how there are some geographical differences between which component of the axis is causing constrained access in certain areas. So here we have a trend line of indicator 4 and indicator 6 for Izumsky Raion in 2024. So it is scored 0 to 3. And this is just an example of what we can do when we try to look at the trends of our scores or its components over time. What happened towards the end of the year of last year in Izumsky was that Russian forces crossed the oblast border, so part of that raion became occupied, and they have become specifically pushing towards the Borova area. Some of the settlements that they have occupied several settlements, for example, Lozova. And this push in Izumsky Raion is part of the southern tip of the Kupiansk encirclement efforts by the Russian forces. And we can see that this development has been reflected in the scores for Izium, and actually within some very relevant components of access severity. So the restrictions of movement within the country within Izium Raion, have increased. And the number of incidents impacting humanitarians as well have increased to a level where we would consider it highest severity level in terms of violence against humanitarians in that raion. Another example is Pokrovsky Raion. So this, of course, has been a very heavily mediatized and also has gotten a lot of attention and reporting in the humanitarian space, the developments in Pokrovsky Raion and around Pokrovsk since August of last year. And we can see, again, it is reflected in our scores. So this is the overall access score for last year. The access score goes from a scale of 0 to 5, and we can see that starting in August, or by August, access scores were quite severe at a 4 to 5, and have, despite being already quite severe, have continued deteriorating as Russian forces have continued to advance in that raion. This has led, of course, to loss of humanitarian access to many settlements as they've gone on the other side of the front line, or simply have become too dangerous to access, but also loss of access to services for civilians as due to destruction and displacement of services. If we want to visualize our access severity scores, we have come up with this map where we can look at the different components of the access severity at the raion level. This example is Luhansk. I chose Luhansk Oblast because it's quite an interesting example. It is almost completely occupied by Russian forces. There is a very, very extremely constrained humanitarian access to that oblast, and also little reporting, at least in humanitarian spaces, on the situation in that oblast. However, if we do look at the access components, it does give us an interesting insight into what the main drivers of access constraints are in this oblast. We will see that civilians face extremely high challenges in accessing services in every raion of this oblast. It is at the highest grade, extreme access constraints, which means it's between a 4 and a 5 out of 5. This is primarily caused by the restrictions on access to services for people who do not have Russian passports. There's also been a lot of reporting around the insufficient healthcare within the oblast, especially in rural areas, and other restrictions to services. However, we do see that the third pillar, the one related to physical and environmental constraints, is relatively low. So since most of the oblast does not have a front line running through it, unlike other frontline oblasts. There's some indicators and sub-indicators that would drive a higher access score in the third pillar are not triggered, and this gives a lower environmental and environmental constraint in the oblast. So this could also be an interesting insight one day should physical access for humanitarians be restored to Luhansk Oblast. We would already have this insight that maybe on the logistical sides there are not as many challenges as they are for civilians' access to services. Another interesting example is Donetsk Oblast. So Donetsk, again, certain areas of the oblast have had a lot of attention, a lot of reporting. The frontline areas are very strongly affected by the conflict, both in the civilians' access to services and assistance, but also on the humanitarian side in terms of restrictions for humanitarians, danger for humanitarians, unfortunately also deaths and injuries of humanitarian actors, and this is all reflected, you will see, in the first two pillars, and as well on the third pillar for some of the frontline raions, especially Pokrovsky and Kramatorsky. However, we can see by breaking it down in the axis in its three components, we can see also the diversity of constraints within the oblast. So Mariupolski Rayon, of course, with Mariupol city, there have been reporting around the continued presence of damages from the conflict, from the height of the conflict in the city back in 2022. And those conflicts and lack of repairs continue driving high extreme constraints to access to services to humanitarians. However, we can see in other parts of the oblast, other raions that are of the oblast that are further away from the front line, as in Luhansk Oblast, perhaps lower constraints on the logistical side in the third pillar. So now I will go on to the last section of this presentation. These are the trends for access in Q4 2024. I will go through them by pillar since that was the structure of this presentation. However, this will not be a comprehensive overview of all of the access developments in Q4. We actually have our report coming out tomorrow, which will go in depth on an oblast by oblast level, and even at the raion level. We'll look at the key constraints for all of the frontline raions and Sumska, as well as other nationwide constraints. But for now, if we look at the Q4 access trends for the first pillar, we'll notice that these trends are higher along the front line and in Russian occupied territories, but they're not exclusive to those territories. This is because conflict related power outages, heating disruptions, and disruptions to other services have happened along the front line and in Russian occupied territories, but also in other areas that were targeted by attacks, as you can see on this map. If we focus then on the front line, we have had the closure of critical services due to the worsening security situation, especially in Donetsk and Kharkivska Oblast. And throughout the Russian occupied territories, this past quarter saw increased reporting on insufficient access to healthcare. It appears to be combined, jointly caused by lack of staff, lack of qualified staff, and also Russian passport requirements for health insurance and healthcare. The second pillar, again, the constraints for humanitarian movement and for the ability of humanitarians to reach people in need. As we see, these constraints are more closely aligned with the front line and with areas that are having active ground conflicts. So the whole crescent from Khersonska to Zaporizhzhia, as well as now Sumska Oblast. So we've had deteriorated physical access for humanitarians in many areas of the front line. Some specific examples are Toretsk, Kurakovo, and Chasiv in Donetsk Oblast, and Vovchanska and Kupianska Hromadas in Kharkivska Oblast. Attacks against humanitarians have continued. In quarter 4, we saw at least 13 publicly reported incidents. Again, only publicly reported incidents, so the likely number of incidents is higher. And also, most of the incidents involved FPV drones. We've also seen continued reporting on the impact of conscription of humanitarian staff on operations. And lastly, the trends in the third pillar. So as you'll see, it is somewhat aligned with the front line, but not exclusively, because we have seen targeting of infrastructure throughout Ukraine and continued air attacks over a lot of the Ukrainian territory, even further west, along with additional disruptions due to weather events. In this pillar, we've seen increased damage to civilian infrastructure in Kharkivska, Khersonska, Kievska, Mykolaiivska, Odessa, and Sumska Oblast. So this is actually data that is taken from our civilian infrastructure data set. If you're interested in exploring this data set, it's another one of our products where we compile information at the oblast and raion level on newly reported damages, broken down by the type of infrastructure as well. So it is a quite interesting resource if you want to look at it. We have also identified intensified conflict, of course, in Pokrovska Hromada and in Boriska, Drovichanska, Kupianska, and Vovchanska Hromadas of Kharkivska Oblast. However, the one positive element for the fourth quarter is that the scheduled power outages were lower than expected during that quarter. So that was it for me. That was an overview of our methodology and a very quick overview of our findings. Again, I invite you to subscribe to our newsletter via scanning the code, as the report with the detailed findings will be published tomorrow. You can stay in touch with us on our social media, or get in touch directly with the hub with the email you see there. So now I'm opening the floor for any questions that you may have. Okay, I see one question on the scores. Okay, so the scores are published. Yes, so our scores are available on a monthly basis. So you can, they reflect the month. They are I think by now they should be updated on a weekly basis. So as we go through and validate new entries and validate the scores, they are updated. I would recommend to maybe look at the previous month. Those are most likely to be most representative. So now we're in early February. I would recommend maybe to only look at the scores until January. But it is an ongoing and never-ending process. And our reports are published on a quarterly basis. So roughly 1 month after the end of the quarter, we do publish the narrative report for the previous quarter.
Hello, I have a question, if I may.
Yes.
Hi, nice to meet you. I'm Raul Vargas from ICRC. Very interesting work. Just to clarify, very simple question. I see that the focus being around the front line, you spoke mainly about issues on the Russian side, but the framework also analyzes Ukrainian side?
Yes. No, the framework analyzes the access constraints in all of the Ukrainian territory and all of the Ukrainian raions. we actually also do have some constraints also for Crimea, although we wouldn't consider those scores the most accurate. But yes, no, and I would say most of our events are for Ukrainian controlled territory. Although, yes, when looking at the constraints that civilians face, it is important to highlight the situation in the Russian occupied territories as well.
Thank you. No, that's very clear. Then, and you've mentioned the limitations of data coming from the Russian side being all public information, correct? Meaning whatever you can find online, I imagine.
Yes. Yeah, of course.
So,
Yeah.
if so, for example, what happens when a rayon is divided by the front line? Which data set do you use? The Ukrainian or Russian side?
Okay, yes. So basically our overall score takes into account all of the events that are logged for that rayon. So that would also take into account the event that triggers the occupation maximum score for the three indicators there. Our data set, however, also includes a separate column called access not occupied, where we kind of create a virtual score for the non-occupied side of the oblast or the rayon by ignoring that event and basically recalculating that score without the event. However, yeah, right now we're not disaggregating geographically ourselves every event into whether it's occupied or non-occupied side.
Thank you. Very interesting cases. Yes. Do you have a methodology of the framework that we can check and go into slower analysis of these nuances?
Yes, of course. I will get it and share it with you.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Any other questions? Yes, Laurent.
Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you, Abim. Thanks a lot for the presentation. And I mean, considering that the methodology you presented is also inspired by the OCHA access monitoring framework, it will be interesting to see this year within the framework of the assessment and analysis working group and the access working group, how these efforts can be maybe made more strengthened and mitigate potential duplications in efforts. As many know, we are conducting an accessibility exercise at the Romada level, but this one is based on focus group discussions, and we do not cover occupied territories because we consider that we don't have enough reliable data to cover that part. Then it will be, I think it will be interesting this year, especially if we have both the AAWG, the assessment and analysis working group and access working group together, to see how we can maximize the impact of the respective work. That was more comment than a question. Thank you.
No, yes, thank you very much, Laurent. And of course, I think already taking our methodology down a level to the rayon level is part of this work and of making sure that we are as relevant as relevant to other efforts in Ukraine on humanitarian access, especially the ones led by OCHA. I see a question from Alex. Yes, very interesting question on the differences on pillars. I will go back maybe to show the both maps. So this is, Alex, your question is exactly the difference, the usefulness of looking at the scores by pillars. So we have In Pillar 1, which is civilians' access to services, we have, let's say, moderate constraints even in central and western parts of the country, whereas when we look at humanitarians' access, these are primarily on the crescent frontline area. So what is driving these moderate areas in the West? So the raions that are directly on the border, these are actually instances of men not being allowed to cross the border. As you remember, these are part of one of the some indicators of a specific event called people not allowed to move to safety, and they follow under these instances. So some of it is linked to that, and the rest of it is linked to those would be along the western borders. So the ones you see, Wolinska, Lviska, Zakarpatty, Ivano-Frankivska, Czernivitska, and Odessa Oblast. And then also disruption to services due to air attacks in central and western oblasts, especially particularly electricity. These months, so those were the main drivers. Any other questions? So would it be possible to analyze each community? So yes, that is thank you for the suggestion, Ludmila. That would be ideally that would be very yeah, we would wish we could be able to do that. I think we wouldn't be able to produce an entire report looking at every single community. However, we have had in the past thematic focuses, and sometimes those thematic focuses are specific community areas. So it is something that our team is tracking, and if there is a specific community that does need its own focus, it can be highlighted in our report. Also, ACAPS in general, ACAPS Ukraine Hub in general, we do produce other thematic reports, and we have produced thematic reports that are focused on geographic areas that do require our attention. So last year we did publish reports on Donetska, Kharkivska, Zaporizhzhia, and Sumska Oblast that did have a more granular geographic focus. Yes, the note. Thank you for reminding me. Raul, I will stop the presentation and find the methodology note to share. In the meantime, if there are any other questions, feel free. And yes, Yumila, of course, if we do look at specific communities, more likely than not, these would be communities along the front line. So I see that, okay. If I see that there are no more questions, again, feel free to reach out to us on social media or directly to our inbox. There should be a survey either linked in the chat. Please don't forget to take it when logging off. And yes, thank you as well, Logan, for answering. There is, of course, OCHA does produce their raion level updates biannually that are very useful and that we also do use for our analysis. Once again, thank you everyone for participating or for joining, and I hope you have a good rest of the day.
Thank you.